Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're bringing you a brand new explainer, and we are taking a trip back in time. And no, not to a big battlefield or some politician's office, but right into the grit and the dirt of an ordinary household. We're talking about the Daniel Spangler family in 1835 Pennsylvania. So let's just dive right into this. We're going to look at how a family of 9, soon to be 10 actually, managed to carve out a life in Sandy Creek Township, Mercer County. This explainer is going to break down the mechanics, the heartbreak, and the absolute triumphs of an era where literally every single day was a fight for survival. I want you to think about this for a second. Could you actually survive a frontier summer? Like, imagine just stepping completely out of our modern world right now. No electricity, no grocery stores down the street, absolutely no modern medicine. Just you, the dirt, your own sweat, and the seriously grueling routines of the 19th century frontier. It's really easy to romanticize the past, but as we're going to see today, the reality was incredibly demanding.
Section 1. Dawn on the Spangler Farm.
Okay, picture this. It is pitch black outside, the air is freezing cold, and the smell of wood smoke is just starting to fill the cabin. Then come the sounds of a huge, bustling household waking up, and this is way before the sun even hits the horizon. Now, I want to let this massive number sink in. 200 acres. That number represents the sheer scale of responsibility resting squarely on the shoulders of 54-year-old Daniel and his 39-year-old wife, Elizabeth. By 1835, they had already been working this land for 6 years, and they definitely weren't alone out there. They were managing a crowded, really lively household with 7 surviving daughters. You've got 17-year-old Anna Maria, all the way down to 3-year-old Rebecca, plus baby Louisa on the way. 200 acres of wheat, corn, oats, hay, livestock, and just endless maintenance.
As you can probably guess, managing those 200 acres required a brutal, totally unyielding schedule. Right at dawn, Daniel and a hired man are up to milk the cows and feed the livestock. Meanwhile, Elizabeth and the older girls are firing up the kitchen stove to prep a breakfast of mush, bread, and preserved meat. Midday, well, that is pure exhausting fieldwork in the blazing summer heat for the men. For the women, it's tackling a full day of laundry using heavy washboards and boiling water, or weeding out the kitchen gardens. And by evening, there is still absolutely no rest. Supper is immediately followed by more milking, more feeding, and then Elizabeth is mending clothes by candlelight while Daniel reads the Bible. It was just a relentless, exhausting volume of daily labor.
Section 2. The Business of Frontier Survival.
So the Spangler family wasn't just a group of people living under one roof. They basically functioned as a self-sustaining corporation that had to adapt to seasonal cycles. Literally everything they did was calculated to ensure they had enough food and supplies to make it through those brutal Pennsylvania winters. Take spring soap making, for example. Step 1, you save up all the animal fat from the winter. Step 2, you process wood ash to make lye. And step 3, you boil it all outdoors in these giant kettles. It was an incredibly smelly, physically taxing seasonal chore, but it perfectly highlights a really crucial point. Women's work wasn't just some light housekeeping. Processing milk into butter and cheese, preserving meat, making the soap, this was the critical economic engine of the farm. Without Elizabeth and her daughters executing these complex, heavy-duty processes, the farm corporation would simply fail. And this corporate mindset even extended to education. Now, in Sandy Creek Township, schooling was pretty intermittent. It usually happened in a one-room schoolhouse during the winter months when the farm demands were a bit lighter. But look at the difference in practical education here. The boys focused heavily on field skills, while girls, like the Spangler daughters, focused on domestic arts, practical math for household accounting, and basic medical care. And here's the really big takeaway from this. These domestic skills were not considered lesser in any way. They were absolute, life-or-death survival skills that would completely determine a family's comfort and honestly their overall prosperity on the frontier. Section 3. Community, Culture, and Celebration. Now, life wasn't all just grueling work and survival mode all the time. Because honestly, without the warmth and deep social bonds of their community, this harsh life would have been entirely unbearable. The Spanglers held really tightly to their German-American roots, and what's super fascinating here is the cultural balancing act they pulled off. They were successfully integrating into American life, dealing in English for community business, and even celebrating the 4th of July. But at home, they spoke German. They sang traditional German hymns around the hearth. Elizabeth served up classic foods passed down from her mother, like sauerbraten, Liebkuchen, and strudel. This rich cultural identity provided some profound comfort and continuity out in such an isolated landscape. And when they needed to get the really big jobs done, they relied on this amazing concept, the work bee. Reciprocal labor was absolutely the backbone of their agricultural and social success.
Things like barn raisings, quilting bees, and corn husking bees brought the whole neighborhood together. It basically turned tedious, backbreaking survival labor into competitive fun. And the best part? These gatherings almost always ended with massive feasts, music, and dancing. It was the ultimate way to break the isolation of farms that were often a quarter-mile or more apart from each other.
Section 4. Courtship on the Frontier. Speaking of community gatherings, that brings us to the high-stakes human drama of frontier romance. I mean, how did you even find a spouse when your nearest neighbor lived a quarter-mile away and you were working from dawn until dusk? The logistical and social complexities of dating in this highly isolated, work-focused environment were intense. You couldn't just hop on an app or go meet up at a local coffee shop. The church and those community work bees were really your only social outlets.
So naturally, this extreme isolation led to incredibly strict rules of courtship. In 1835, 17-year-old Anna Maria was actually being courted by a neighbor named Joseph Carringer, and the requirements were intense. Any home visits had to be directly supervised by Elizabeth. If they walked to church, the younger siblings were tagging along as chaperones. For the most part, courtship just consisted of stolen glances during Sunday services. But the crucial point here is that Daniel and Elizabeth were rigorously evaluating Joseph. They were looking at his family's reputation, his religious commitment, and above all else, his work ethic and his ability to support a family. Because back then, marriage was an economic partnership just as much as a romantic one.
Section 5. Hardships and an American Legacy. Now, we need to impartially examine the severe realities these families faced and the lasting generational impact of their incredible efforts. 2. That number hits hard. It represents the 2 infant children the Spangler family had already lost by 1835. It instantly grounds us in the precarious, often heartbreaking reality of 19th century medical care. It was primitive, and the constant threat of childhood illness just hung over every single parent. Plus, childbirth itself was incredibly dangerous, yet Elizabeth had already borne 8 children and would go on to have 2 more. Economically speaking, they lived on a razor's edge of constant uncertainty. Looking at the asset side, sure, they had 200 acres, some livestock, and incredible survival skills. But on the threat side, just one crop failure, one outbreak of livestock disease, or one severe weather disaster could literally wipe them out entirely. In fact, our source notes that when Daniel died years later in 1851, his probate records show that his estate barely had enough to cover its debts. So even after decades of relentless labor, the margins were still that thin. But against all odds, they persevered. Our source material perfectly synthesizes their reality with this quote: hard work, simple pleasures, strong community bonds, and the constant hope that the next generation would have better opportunities. That was really the overarching heartbeat of the Spangler family's 1835 experience. They were building a foundation, not necessarily for their own immense wealth, but so their kids could spread across the continent with a slightly better chance at life. Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. If a lifetime of exhausting labor barely covers your debts but secures the future for your descendants, is the frontier struggle worth the cost? It's a profound question about legacy, sacrifice, and the true price of building the American frontier. The Spanglers made their choice, dedicating literally every waking hour to that 200-acre tract in Pennsylvania. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer today. Keep wondering, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.